Hi again. Here's the second of two interviews I recorded at Motive, the crime and mystery festival put on by the Toronto International Festival of Authors. I spoke this time with South African novelist Deon Meyer about The Dark Flood, his latest in the Benny Griessel series of mystery novels.
My name is Nathan Maharaj. I'm Director of Content Marketing and the producer of the Kobo and Conversation podcast for Rakuten Kobo. I am so pleased to be welcoming you to this very special chat with novelist Deon Meyer as part of Motive, Toronto's Crime and Mystery Festival. Deon Meyer, as I'm sure you know, is the internationally published author of more than a dozen novels, several short story collections, screenplays for TV series, and feature films. He's probably best known to you all as the writer of the Benny Griessel detective novels. The latest in the series is called The Dark Flood, in which Benny and his friend Vaughn Cupido have fallen on hard times, professionally speaking, and they find themselves working as warrant officers, which is a long way from the elite Hawks unit they normally work in. And yet, trouble still finds Detective Griessel, as it always does. Deon Meyer, welcome to Motive, the Crime and Mystery Festival.
Thank you, Nathan. It's a real pleasure to be on the show. And I am so impressed by your pronunciation of the character names. How did you do that?
Well, let me tell you something. My family, the Maharajas, are from Durban. I have an aunt and cousin who lived in Cape Town for quite some time as well, after living here in Canada. So we're getting a little. I'm doing as good a local as I can for you. I have opinions on the representation of the samosas in the book. There's a vision I have that not everyone else has, because a proper South African samosa is tight and hard, can be implemented as a weapon. Yeah. So that's how I come by the proper pronunciation. That and a bit of YouTube. Speaking of pronunciation, I was hoping we could hear from you short reading of the novel.
Sure, I'd love to. I'm going to read a couple of pages from the very beginning of the book, and here goes. He abandoned the dossier on his desk, grabbed his Z88 from the drawer and ran. Vuzi was small of stature, the quiet one, always calm, but not now. The urgency in his voice meant Griessel did not hesitate. He fastened his holster around his hips as he ran down the passage. Vaughn Cupido was approaching, long coat flapping behind him, in his bat suit, his winter gear. Praise the Lord, said Cupido. Vaughn hated the tedium of police paperwork. They had been buried in dossiers for days. This was a reprieve. Captains Frankie Philander and Moy Willem Liebenberg emerged from their shared office, shoes drumming on the bare-tiled floor of the Directorate of Priority Crime Investigation, the DPCI, in Belleville, a herd stampeding to the armory on the first floor. Ndabeni was already inside, passing out R5 assault rifles and spare magazines. Warrant Officer Bossy Bossert scribbling hurried notes in his inventory. I want a stompie, said Cupido. Vuzi gave him the short Beretta RS-200 shotgun with a pistol grip and a cartridge belt. You've always got to be otherwise, eh, said Philander. It's a cash-in-transit heist, not a bank robbery. Method in my madness, Uncle, said Cupido. You just wait and see. Just bring them back, Bossert shouted after them. After morning parade over the previous 5 months, they had been kept informed of Vuzi's investigation. He had been working on the flurry of in-transit heists in the Western Cape. The same gang, the same modus operandi. 10 men in 4 stolen cars would ambush the transit van. One vehicle, always old and heavy, would be deliberately rammed into the security van, forcing it to a standstill. The other cars would encircle it and open fire with, according to post-action ballistic tests, AK-47s and exotic collection of small arms, until the guards surrendered, or the explosives would be used on the rear doors if they would not. An estimated 14 million rand had already been stolen. The robbers were phantoms. They left no solid forensic evidence behind. Ndabeni was at his wit's end and under extreme pressure from his commanding officer, Colonel Mbali Kaleni. So now the 5 detectives raced off at 150 kilometers per hour in two unmarked cars, the BMW X3 leading and the Ford Everest behind, to the N1 first, then heading east.
That's wonderful. I want to ask you to start, just tell me about Benny in this book. He's been with you a long time. He is kind of a, your companion. And I want to just kind of ask you, he's doing okay in this book. He seems to be starting out all right. Sobriety seems to be sticking. Can you talk a bit about your vision for him in The Dark Flood?
Yeah, one of the difficult things of writing a series is to keep the characters fresh, to keep pace with the life phases that the characters go through. If you don't do that, then the characters stagnate. They become exactly the same in every book. So I've always tried to make my characters, specifically Benny Griessel and Vaughan Cupido, sort of grow with the phases in their lives. Benny, since Devil's Peak, which was his first protagonist role, had gotten divorced. He's fallen in love again. He's now living with the love of his life, Alexa Barnard, and they got engaged, and now the wedding is ahead. So he's got these new personal challenges, but then there's also the alcoholism. When I created him, he was a much lesser character, and this is many years ago in Dead Before Dying. I created a character on the fly for a very specific role, turned him into a drunk cop because he needed to be drunk for the scene. When I loved writing about him so much that I wanted to use him as a protagonist, which happened in Devil's Peak, and then I had the very interesting challenge of trying to do something different with an alcoholic cop, which is a bit of a cliche in the genre. Mm. So I've always tried to be as honest as real about his alcoholism as I can. In the South African Police Service, if policemen and women suffer from PTSD, as Benny does, then they usually get treatment. They can speak to a shrink. And those who stick to it slowly but surely recuperate. And I've tried to do that with Benny. Mm. Also, because so many readers kept sending me emails saying, please don't let Benny fall off the wagon again, because they feel a lot of compassion with him. And, I share that. You can only put your characters through so much in every book. And if you keep on doing the same thing, it becomes boring. So I've tried to keep pace. And yes, there's definitely in Benny's personal life, things are looking up. He's slowly but surely conquering the alcoholism, or at least coming to terms with it and staying on the wagon. And he's also become, I think, a lighter character. He used to be, especially when he was divorced and drinking a lot, he was a bit depressive. But I think Benny has lit up a lot, thanks to Vaughan Cupido, his partner as well. And my vision for him for this book was to really make him less serious and more playful, and make the whole book a little bit lighter and more entertaining.
Yeah, I mean, and to that point, you remove Benny and Vaughan from the high pressure elite hawks, and it's and they're warrant officers. They're strolling about, essentially, all but tethered to a desk, doing paperwork and walking around. And you move them also, interestingly, you move them location-wise. I'm going to ask you about that in a sec, but first, give us a sense of the Hawks. What because that's an important frame to be leaving behind.
Yeah, the Hawks is one of the big elite units in the South African Police Service. If you look at the history of the police in South Africa, there's always been these elite squads. So when I started writing 94, 95, the Serious and Violent Crimes Unit was called Murder and Robbery Squad, and you had a separate squad for drug investigation. You had a separate squad for economic crimes. And then I think about 10, 12 years ago, the police structure changed, and they decided to bring all the elite units under the umbrella of the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigations. And within the DPCI, there are these various units, the serious and violent crimes. That's where Benny and Vaughan used to work. And then you have crimes against the state, you have economic crimes, and you have an organized crime investigation unit. And it's really the best of the best, the elite detectives who get drawn into the Hawks. And especially for Vaughn Cupidor, this was a matter of huge pride for him. He is a good cop, but he also knows that he's a good cop, and he sort of believes that he's a good cop, and he can be a little bit arrogant at times, but it's his great pride and joy to be part of the Hawks. And because of what transpired in my previous novel, The Last Hunt, they both get disciplined, and they get kicked out of the Hawks, and they have to go back to an ordinary police station. Now, that's the other level of structure in the South African police service, is that in every fairly big town in South Africa, you have a police station with a detective unit, and then the uniformed people who are separate. And Benny and Vaughn, they are very worried they're going to get sent to a very small town in the Karoo called Laingsburg, and Vaughn says that that's purgatory. You know, that's the biggest, the worst it can get. But luckily, they get sent to Stellenbosch, which is a different kettle of fish.
It is a different kettle of fish, and it's a kettle of fish you know well. It was. I thought it was really interesting that you sent them as punishment, to your backyard.
Yeah, well, if I don't want to give any spoilers, but there's a reason why they get sent to Stellenbosch, which comes out later in the book. But they are also usually relieved. They believe that Colonel Mbali Kaleni, their Hawks commanding officer, enabled this, and they are very grateful to her for doing that. But yeah, I mean, Stellenbosch is a much more cushy job than Laingsburg. Stellenbosch is the second oldest sort of colonial town in South Africa. It is the most beautiful town in South Africa. It's got a beautiful history. It's got great architecture. It sort of nestles in the mountains. It's smack in the middle of the wine country, of the wine area in the Western Cape. A lot of history. There's a huge university here. The town's got this vibrancy about it, all these young people. So and one of the reasons why I brought them here was because Mariana and I, my wife and I, moved here 11, 12 years ago, and we've grown to love this place. We absolutely adore Stellenbosch. It's a wonderful place to live. And when you really love something and you grow passionate about it, then you want to sort of share that passion. And that was one of the ideas that I had, was to write about Stellenbosch, but not my view of Stellenbosch, Benny and Vaughn's view, and also the other characters sprinkled throughout the novel. And Vaughn's view of Stellenbosch is very different to Benny's and to my own, and it's a very interesting view. And that's one of the great things of writing, is that you can see the world, see the environment, see South Africa, or see Stellenbosch through the eyes of your different characters. And I often feel enriched by that.
I wanted to ask you about representation of place, because as we mentioned off the top, I have roots in South Africa. I haven't been, but I have some representation of that through family and those family stories. And what I loved about this book was being there, and the specificity. Like, it's not another book set in Johannesburg and we're getting big urban life. We're like, well, no, the city is there, but it's over there. And we're here, and this is a little different. And the traffic sucks, but day-to-day life is okay, except for alarming violent crimes. But we're reading detective novels here, so there have to be conceits to genre. Right? In lovely places, bad stuff happens. That's why it's interesting. Right. I wanted to ask though, if you're conscious of, as an internationally published writer, as a writer who, from the jump, you're writing in Afrikaans, your books are on a voyage of adaptation to different audiences from the moment you finish the manuscript. And I wanted to ask how you conceive of that burden of representation, or if it feels like a burden, knowing that maybe a reader will read only one book, even set in South Africa, even in sub-Saharan Africa, maybe in a year, in 3 years. How do you view that? Does it have anything to do with the writing, or do you just have to do your thing?
Nathan, that's a great question with a complicated answer. When my books were being translated for the first time and I started doing international events in the Northern Hemisphere, we were at a point in South Africa's post-apartheid history where tourism had become our greatest source of foreign currency. It was also the industry in South Africa that created the most jobs, especially for the unemployed and the impoverished. So I saw it as one of the small contributions I could make to the rebuilding of our country, to really go out and promote South Africa as a tourist destination, because it is probably the most fabulous tourist destination in the world, and also one of the most inexpensive because of the exchange rate. And I kept running into this dichotomy of writing crime fiction, about the dark underbelly of a society, but in the same breath trying to promote South Africa. But I really struggled with that. How do I manage that? And then I realized that crime fiction readers are intelligent people, and they know that whether they're reading a Michael Conley that's set in LA and it's all about crime, that's not what LA is all about, or a book set anywhere in the world. And people do have the intelligence to realize that this is just a small window into a much bigger society. But I've also tried to show people who read the book a little bit about the other side of South Africa, the wonderful people, the diversity in terms of ethnicity and culture and landscapes, etc., etc. But eventually you've got to knuckle down and write the story. And I think if you can make the characters human and the story interesting, then people will be fascinated by it anyway. The other interesting thing is that as writers from Africa, we are always up against the prejudices of people from the Northern Hemisphere when they think about Africa. It's much harder for African authors to make breakthroughs internationally because there's a certain view, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, that Africa is not a place where you go to find entertainment and a fun read, that it's going to be dark, it's going to be about disease or poverty or violence or whatever the case may be. But you got to keep that out of your head and just try and write as good a crime fiction story as you can, and believe that readers have the intelligence to distinguish between crime fiction and the real world.
Well, so on the subject of narrative craft, this book drops us on page one with the reading you gave is grabbing guns at hand to go intercept some bad guys in flight. It's a gripping intro, and it's kind of a ski jump because we fly off of it, and it's even in the table of contents. It's July, and then we skip ahead, and then we're September, and there's this gap, and it sort of sends the whole novel spinning. Can you tell me a little bit about writing that intro, and how you conceive of bringing the reader in and setting that momentum?
I knew when I started the book, and I had the story broadly in my head, I knew that setting up the real meat of the story, the sort of the Stellenbosch part of the story, was going to take a bit of time, and it's not going to be a quick fix to do that. But if I write a first couple of chapters that really has incredible pace and suspense and tension, then hopefully the reader will think, well, if it starts like this, then there'll be more of this if I read through those first chapters of the Stellenbosch part. So that was really a little bit of a planned part for me. And I also, there's a tie in between that first section and the firearms used that becomes relevant later in the book. Mm-hmm. So I could tie those things together. But it was so much fun to write that first part. I think it's the first time that I've actually, because detectives usually don't go out on that sort of action fold. They detect, they go to a murder scene, they look for clues, and then they start the legwork. So it was a lot of fun to write it. And I had so much fun that I wanted, as an author, to come back to that sort of setup later in the book, which I of course did. But it was really a lot of fun to write.
Yeah, I mean, it was fun to read, and like exactly as you say, detecting is a craft of the past tense, and these opening chapters are intensely present tense.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we're not going to do any spoilers. So that's
right.
Anybody who's worried about, oh my God, these guys are about to dive into, no, we're not diving too deep into plot. We get this interesting view of corruption, and I think you alluded to this, of course, because sort of touching that third rail of corruption is kind of what Benny and Vaughn get burned from is they're a little too good at their jobs, maybe. Right. But rather than staying in that sort of police force area, we get into a really interesting aspect of it, which is, if a country is twisted enough economically, then things like the real estate market won't work. They won't work right. And so we get this character, Sandra Steenberg, who's a hardworking real estate agent, very irregular income, but the bills are very regular. And we get this sense of peril that I thought was actually a really interesting thing, because for me, I was thinking, I know Benny and Vaughn are going to be fine. They can handle themselves. But there is a looming threat over Sandra, and she is having to give it her all to make her family finances come together, not lose the house, not divulge, all the final notices spilling out in front of her husband. Can you tell me a little bit about writing Sandra and setting up that kind of a threat?
Yeah, it's the old adage of conflict is the mother of suspense. So that's the one thing that I wanted to do. I wanted to give Sandra so many sources of conflict to build up the suspense of, is she going to be able to manage what she's doing? She's, as you said, single breadwinner. Her husband is an author. He's taking time off to write a book. And she's trying to keep everything together. But the real estate market is shot. And then she gets offered this huge opportunity to make a very, very big commission. But there's a twist in this, in that what she has to sell. She has to sell for this corporate fraudster, and he's a sex pest too. So, it makes it really difficult for her. So the one part was really to create conflict. The other part is to motivate her actions later in the book. I needed to set that up from the start. I needed for the reader to root for her, and when she does certain things, that the reader would say, I'm with you. I understand why you're doing this. So those were the two things that I had to juggle, that I had to balance, that I had to try to get right in terms of Sandra Steenberg.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hugely relatable situation she's in, because it's very like, it's like meat and potatoes, adult problems that everyone is either faced or, will spend some time every day making sure they're not facing it. So it's one of those threats that's always there. She also has that twist. So you mentioned this client, this problematic client of hers, is one of many men in her life for whom is an irritant to her. We get this view. I thought it was really interesting. We were seeing through Sandra's eyes for most of the book. We actually don't have a great view of her, but we keep hearing these men saying things about her, which was this whole other aspect of kind of a low-level bubbling threat out at the periphery that even her boss, who's allegedly on her side, refers to as Longoria, even though I looked into it. Eva Longoria, the actress who he's referring to, has no record as a real estate agent. It is not. There is not a direct compliment to her professional acuity here.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it's. I wrote the book sort of midway through the Me Too movement and all the revelations from Hollywood moguls who were. These sex pests. And it really got me thinking about what women have to go through every day by men who just don't think what they're saying or are just stupid. And how that constant attack on women, how that must make them feel. And I try to put myself through that and ask what would this do to a character? How would she react? How would that make her feel? And again, as I said earlier, seeing that through the eyes of a character can be very enriching. It teaches you a lot. But of course, part of that too is to set up Sandra's character and also motivation for certain things that she does.
The client of hers, Jasper Boonstra, he's based on a real life figure. Can you tell me about this sort of, is it maybe a satire, like what you were working at here in this character?
Well, he's based on several real life people, not just one. I mean, there is a very famous South African corporate fraudster and a very big corporate fraud case in South Africa, probably the biggest in our history, happened in Stellenbosch. So a lot of readers would think that Jasper Boonstra, the mogul in the book, is based on this guy. And I mean, yes, he inspired him, but he's not based on him at all. I never knew the guy. So but I had a look. In South Africa, we've had a few very important, big, prominent figures who got into corruption. So I think there's a little bit of all of them. And then also, as I said, some of these Hollywood film moguls that were very much in the news, I borrowed from them substantially as well. So there's not just one person that he is based
on. So I want to ask about you've been writing Benny for a while now. It's coming up on, I guess it's 18 years. I mean, conventionally, that's long enough to, raise a child and then they're ready to move out. So I wanted to ask, are you, do you see sending Benny off to do anything, to go forge his own thing, and maybe you move on to spending your time somewhere else? Maybe the market does need another bass player. Like maybe he has underestimated the need for bass players.
Well, you never know. I've always maintained that if I find a story that needs totally different and new characters, I will write that and create them, as I've done with Fever and to a certain extent with Trackers and Dead at Daybreak. It's been a strange journey. When I started writing, I did not want to write a series for two reasons. The one was because I felt that story comes first. And you've got to find a story that excites you as an author, that you really think is worth telling, that excites you, that gets you passionate and gets you going. Because it's a marathon. To write a novel is a marathon, so you better have enough juice to get through it. And so not character shouldn't come first, but story should come first. The second thing was that I was very unsure whether I had it in me to find stories for the same character over and over again and keep that interesting. Especially when you're a newbie writer, a young writer, you don't know what you can do. And I really didn't think I would be able to do that. And then with Benny, finding a favor from readers and from publishers, the pressure started coming, write more Benny novels because people seem to love this character. And then, lo and behold, you start finding stories that fit Benny because you like writing about him, readers like reading about them, publishers like publishing books in a series. And it sort of conspires to make you do the series and do book after book. But again, if I think I have a great story that doesn't fit Benny, then I'm quite happy to go there. The interesting thing for me, and I remember I had conversations with Michael Conley and Ian Rankin some years ago, where about this thing of aging your character in real-term years. And that made Bosch and Rankin's Rebus having to retire. And I was very happy that I didn't do that. I sort of didn't let Benny age. I think in the last 16 years, Benny has aged 2 years. And no reader has ever commented on it. They seem to like Benny in his 40s, struggling with it. So his life progress has been much slower than real time, more in terms of book by book. So that keeps him fresh. That gives him more legs, I think, to keep on going. We'll have to see. One of the things that will definitely influence where Benny and Vaughan will be going is what happens politically in South Africa, what happens in terms of the police force in South Africa, because I always want them to, be the good guys and keep fighting the good fight. So that's the one thing that might influence it, but I'm very positive. We've got a wonderful president now who's making big changes and getting things back on track. So I'm pretty sure that I'm just hoping that Benny and Vaughan can get back into the Hawks. They want to get back there too. So no, I'll keep writing about them. Whether they'll eventually get back to the Hawks, we'll have to see. I have certain other ideas at the moment.
Oh, brilliant. I mean, even if things go badly, like it's that's the wonderful thing about detective novels, right? It's the world as it is. It's not as we necessarily want it to be.
Yes.
And so if things go utterly sideways, well, we follow Detective Griessel through a sideways spinning world.
Right. I mean, I did that. Machu Bear was the protagonist in Dead Before Dying, and he became a PI, private investigator. So there's always that option, although Vaughan Cupido would hate to do that. He really looks down on private detectives. He thinks it's a cop-out, pardon the pun. So I doubt whether they'll go that route, but it is an option to look at, maybe a way out in future if all else fails.
Right. I mean, so speaking of writing other things, you have written for the screen. And you've worked as producer, director. So I wanted to ask about this multimedia kind of experience that you have, and yet writing not just genre fiction, but writing a series, writing a character that you return to time and again. Do you think about cinema? Do you think about screen when you're writing? Thinking about making your can I make the job of selling the option easier for myself here?
No.
Or does it have to just be a great novel?
No, it's hard enough to make a novel work. And I think if you start thinking and worrying about will this translate to the screen, you're going to be totally lost. I think that's a very slippery slope. When I write a novel, I focus totally on the novel. Novel structure is so different. The whole approach to novel writing is so different to writing a screenplay that you can't not focus and concentrate on that. So I don't think about that at all. As a matter of fact, just for instance, if you write a screenplay, especially in the South African context, then budget is one of the biggest issues. You can't create a scene where you have, let's say, a football stadium filled with 80,000 people. But in a novel, you can do whatever you want. And that's why when I write a novel, I go ahead and I write scenes that I know will be impossible to film as is, because it's going to be just too expensive. And there's a certain pleasure in that freedom that in a novel you can do that. Yeah. While in a screenplay, it's totally different.
Right. And movies are nothing happens in a movie without buy-in of a dozen people.
Yeah, exactly. And usually there's a broadcaster involved, so you get a lot of feedback, a lot of notes that you have to, and a lot of rewrites, and then the director takes your screenplay and he or she does what they want with it. But my experience is, though, that when a screenplay gets made, all these levels of creativity from the director, from the camera people, from the lighting people, from the sound people, the actors. I mean, actors, I've learned to respect their craft so much. They give life to characters that you created that is beyond your wildest imagination. And then there's the editor and the music. It's a much more of a collaborative effort. It's a lot of creativity coming together and creating something that is much bigger and better than it was in your head.
Yeah. Yeah, quite unlike the loneliness of the novelist, who has ultimate power.
Yeah. Which is also scary, because you can't blame anyone else if it's a failure.
Yeah, it's not the cinematographer's fault in the novel if the scene didn't work right.
Exactly. Yeah.
You've mentioned a few other novelists as we've been talking, and Ian Rankin and his Inspector Rebus, and Bosch from Michael Connelly's novels. These are, of course, detective novels, and some of the best going right now. What do you read for fun? What's on your nightstand?
I read both Connelly and Ian Rankin. I read all the Lee Child. I mean, Lee Child has always been a great favorite, but I must admit that, especially when I'm writing, I read very little fiction. I read nonfiction. I love reading biographies. I read about the economy and politics and history. I love reading history. So I would say 80% of my reading is nonfiction, simply because I find it very hard, especially when I'm writing, and for the past few years I've always been writing. I find it very intrusive. It's very hard for me to read fiction without reading it like a writer. You're so used to, as a writer, to read what you're writing and to assess and to try and find fault with it so that you can improve, that it's hard to switch that part off when I'm reading fiction. So I save the Connollys and the Rankins and the Lee Childs and all the other great crime fiction authors for when I take a holiday after I finish the book. It's usually 2 or 3 months that I just read fiction before I start a new book.
And yet, I was delighted as I was reading this book, and you I think you've been doing this forever, is peppering in little, like, if someone wants to get familiar with the literature of South Africa, they need only just pay attention in reading your book, because there are little pieces. Sandra Steenberg's husband, who is taking his time to write his novel, is a scholar of Ivan Vladislavich,
yes,
and the surname Kutsea just sort of floats around in there. So it's is that just a game, or is that a little bit of the sort of South African Board of Tourism agenda that you alluded to?
No, it's part of the agenda. No, I mean, I'm so proud. I mean, South African won the Booker Prize. We've got J.M. Coetzee. Ivan Vladislavich is just so incredibly good a writer, and there's a little bit of bragging. I can say I'm a South African writer too. I'm not as good as these guys, but I'm part of this. I'm so proud of them.
Yeah. You've in interviews I read that you got a case of COVID, and you experienced the brain fog, which I think is probably like one of the scariest things that people hear about with COVID. I mean, other than like mortality, is the idea of like carrying on with cognitive disability. Can you kind of describe that a little bit? What was that like? As a writer, you're reaching for familiar things. What was it like?
Nathan, it was very weird, because my wife and I caught COVID before COVID was really big in South Africa, and we didn't know we had COVID. I mean, I was, I had fever and the terrible headaches and the tiredness, and it was like a very, very, very bad flu. My symptoms weren't as bad, but we didn't know that it was COVID until several months after the lockdown, and I finally went to the doctor for an annual checkup, and I described my symptoms, and he said, "You had COVID." But the brain fog, we sort of had COVID, and then a month and a half later we went into lockdown. And for me, the lockdown was a godsend, because suddenly my diary was open and I could really knuckle down and write The Dark Flood. Otherwise, I would have really battled to finish it in that year. And having all this time and then sitting down and realizing one of the great things I've always prided myself on, and I've always enjoyed as an author, is my powers of concentration. I can sit down and really get my mind into the book and live in that world and write for 2 or 3 or 4 hours until I realize that I'm so stiff from sitting down now that I need to get up. But, I'm in there and I'm writing. And for the first time in my life, I couldn't write for more than 10 or 15 minutes, and really with great effort trying to concentrate. I could get into this world, and then I couldn't concentrate anymore. So I wrote the first half of that book in little 20-minute bursts, and then I would go away and come back and write again. And it slowly got better. every day it got a little bit better, and I think after about 6 or 7 months, I was back to normal. And then Marianne and I got COVID again early this year, and I went through the same thing, but luckily this time it cleared up much quicker. The first time around, I didn't lose my sense of smell and taste. Second time around, I lost it all. It's only starting to come back now.
God. Well, I'm glad to see you in good health now, and I'm glad the novel
in good health.
And I'm glad the novel turned out so brilliantly too, despite that adversity. We're at time. Deon Meyer, I want to thank you so much for this wonderful chat.
Thank you, Nathan. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
Yeah,
take care.
We'll be back soon with more new episodes of Kobo in Conversation. In the meantime, check out Deon Meyer's books, especially the latest one, The Dark Flood. And you don't need to know the rest of the series to enjoy this one. It was my intro too, and it was great. This episode contains audio from the Toronto International Festival of Authors and was produced by me, Nathan Maharaj. Thank you for listening.